From Minneapolis, Minnesota, welcome to Playwright Center's Theater Begins Here.
Today, theater begins with dark fantasy. But first, a membership highlight. Join our membership program to access our database of play submission opportunities. Each year, we add roughly 1,000 new play submission opportunities for playwrights around the world. It's sortable and searchable, and a great place to find a home for your new play. Access it at pwcenter.org. And now, on to the show. Today, we are thrilled to invite Riti Sachdeva to join us. Riti is a performance maker and cultural worker. She has been creating art in some shape, pattern, or rhythm for over 25 years, incorporating text, installation, song, and dance into her writing and performance. She straddles the practices and conventions of traditional U.S. theater, performance art, and international approaches to theater. Interweaving the personal, political, and arcane, she has crafted the singular Indo-Gothic aesthetic of her work. Her playwriting fellowships include the Dramatists Guild Fund, which awarded her the 2019 Tom Thomas Playwriting Award, the Public Theater's EWG, WP Theater Lab, Ingram New Works Lab, and New Georges. She is the recipient of the Kennedy Center ACTF Quest for Peace Award and Sultan Pandamsi Award for her play Parts of Parts and Stitches, and a Theater Communications Group / Mellon Foundation travel grant to begin adapting her play, Suicide Seed, to the Kathakali dance theater form. Her play, The Rug Dealer, made the 2016 Kilroy's list. Additionally, plays have been developed by Phoenix Theater, Working Theater, Center Stage, The Civilians, the Playwright Center, NNPN, the University of Hawaii, and Lincoln Center Directors Lab. Acting performance highlights include work with National Hispanic Cultural Center, Pop-Up Theatrics, Honest Accomplice, HBO, Disney, lots of cool indie films, and an outstanding one-act award from Planet Connections for her performance art show, Seen/Unseen. She continues to develop her solo show, Behind Every Favorite Song is an Untold Woman, part cabaret, part memoir, part mythicism. As a cultural worker, Riti was a sexuality educator with South Asian Youth Action in Queens, a teaching artist and community organizer with Somos Los Otros and Cambio in Albuquerque, and a founding sister of South Asian Women for Action in Boston. Her cultural works activate the crossroads of solidarity, economic, gender, and racial justice, and the arts, with intergenerational, cross-cultural, transnational communities. Riti was a Playwright Center core writer from 2020 to 2023. Welcome, Riti.
Thank you.
It's so good to have you here.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Well, we like to ask everyone at the beginning, how did your theatrical journey begin?
Yeah, playing Charlie's Angels on the grounds of the Ringe Towers in North Cambridge when I was growing up. That was my beginnings in the theatrical journey. We were like brown, black, and yellow angels solving mysteries of UFO abductions and other monsters. And I think that never left me, the desire to have that kind of play central in my life. As an adult, I started off my arts journey making installation art, and that moved into making performance art. I was doing things like adapting poetry into performance pieces. When I moved to Albuquerque, I was working as a visual art coordinator at Working Classroom as an organization there. And they were also a theater organization. And I started taking acting classes there and got cast in productions. Then I started dancing flamenco and started bringing all of this stuff together to devise bigger pieces, like devising more historical pieces with collaborators. And as I got more into the acting and the creating stories, I realized, okay, I really want to write roles for myself. And that's when I got into the playwriting. I have like so much arts experience, and theater really is a place to bring them together.
That's incredible. From Charlie's Angels to all of these different artistic mediums to becoming a writer. Do you mind saying where you were in your, age, career range when you started writing?
I started writing probably like writing plays. Believe I was in my late 30s.
That's cool. That's really cool.
So when did you officially decide that theater is the career you wanted? Kind of specifically with playwriting, because you came at it at a later time. So when were you like, this is what I want to do? This is the path I'm taking.
Yes. So I have a love-hate relationship with the idea of career. I really did not imagine the trajectory of my life in terms of career. If anyone ever asked me what I wanted to be when I would grow up, which I don't remember, I'm sure they did. I don't know what I said. I just made something up, I'm sure, like whatever was expected of me, doctor, engineer, president, I don't know. Because what I wanted my life to be was an experience. Just, I wanted to experience life, a life. I wanted to make a life. And a lot of my earlier focus, starting in my teens, was doing social justice work, doing anti-racism work, gender justice work. So I imagined that that's the way that I would be really moving in the world and the communities and the kind of work, like jobs that I would be doing, or the tasks or the events. That's what I imagined myself doing. As I got more into the arts, I started understanding ways that those could move together. So I started playwriting, and I was a visiting artist, a teaching artist in Albuquerque public schools. And I was kind of burnt out from working in schools, and just like, okay, I am going to go to grad school and learn the craft of playwriting, because I'm already devising, I'm already writing. I might as well like just do this. And University of New Mexico public school in New Mexico is like super affordable. It cost me less to go there for, like 3 years than it did rent for a year in New York. So I was learning how to write plays as a, 37, 38-year-old MFA candidate in dramatic writing. And because I was part of an institution like UNM, I had exposure to the theater industry, like the larger industry that was happening in nationally and in New York specifically, being exposed to people who worked there. Even like Rihanna Yazzie was a UNM student, and she had moved to Minneapolis for, I think, a Jerome Fellowship, and then started. So, like she was legendary at UNM. And so just understanding that there actually is an industry behind theater also. It's not just sort of the grassroots work and festival circuit that I had been doing for years. So that I think that when I graduated from UNM and had opportunities with National New Play Network and the Kennedy Center, it really ignited this ambition to be part of the industry and think of my work as much as a career as a calling.
That's beautiful. I like that shift in perspective around career and around what you said, wanting to experience and make a life for yourself. That's gorgeous. Well, our topic today is about dark fantasy, and I would love to find out from you about your early exposure to it and what attracted you to dark fantasy, and also how it sort of falls into, what we've already heard about you in this trajectory.
I was born in India, spent the first 6 years of my life there. And there's a lot of mythology, specifically Hindu mythology, but stories from other faiths, Muslim, Sikh, Christian faiths. And we used to have these stories in comic books. And so my early exposure to storytelling was these amazing, fantastical stories about gods and humans and animals and the faith, miracles, destruction, told through these comic books that, probably my cousins used to read to me, maybe my parents too. And that is the indelible form, right, of storytelling for me. I cannot think of telling a story that doesn't have some aspect of that kind of supernatural, miraculous thing happening. Also used to watch Hindi language films, and those also have a lot of that sense of a miracle happening, whether it's like these three brothers who were separated at birth, and then by the end, through faith and great works and struggles and trials, they are reunited in the end. And then when we moved to the US, I was often attracted to, when I would watch TV and stuff, other than sort of cartoons and things that kids watch, I was fascinated by these movies. They often had a Christian kind of message, but they would be about like these saints weeping, and I was just fascinated by the possibility that things that we can't maybe actually know for sure, like that we can't prove, are possible. So that I think that is a very early exposure that has never left.
Yeah. A lot of dark fantasy exists in like folklore that's supposed to be teaching specifically children lessons or like parables for adults. And I feel like those are a lot of people's first entry point into it, but you don't recognize it until later when you start seeing it in very overt dark fantasy, and you're like, oh, well, this is based off of this, and I see where they got this theme from and like this trend. So how would you, for people that think of fantasy, and you taught a seminar about this for us, that think of fantasy as more of like pixies and fairies, what does dark fantasy mean, and what does that look like?
First, I think it's really a matter of perception, right? It's really the individual lens that we may, as individuals, see stuff, and then maybe a more cultural lens that theater makers or performance makers see it through. For me, it's something that evokes certain sensations. It has a certain aesthetic, certain tone. I think that it's a combination of horror and awe and wonder, absurdity, faith, miracles, and the erotic also. It's really it's a metaphor, right, for sorrow and grief and fury, rage, fear, disbelief. It's really about a delving into the shadow side of something, and just thinking that the shadow side, exploring those dark, shadowy corners, is delicious, right? The dark parts of the psyche that plot revenge or harbor contempt and disgust or envy. To me, those are the feelings and the themes and the sensations and the tone of dark fantasy.
Wow, that was incredible there. I want to read that metaphor for sorrow, grief, like, that was, just sort of expanding for my own thinking about how I experience, dark fantasy in my own life as a child, as a teenager, as an adult, how you talk about how both religion and sort of mythology and, fables sort of all contain these elements. It's all around us. And sometimes I'm thinking right now about what an impact it has had on my life without me realizing it. I think that's what's happening right now. When you think about a play, what elements make a play dark fantasy? You just talked about so many elements of dark fantasy, but how do they change the structure or the feel or, the way one writes a play?
Yeah, as we had discussed in the workshop that I taught, I think there's certain themes or plot points or characters that can be part of dark fantasy, like talking to the dead, talking animals, time travel, people, places, and things that have extraordinary powers, weird, strange, grotesque stuff happening or being done to the body, like torture, revenge, captivity, dystopia, and again, miracles and absurdity. I mean, the thing is that all of those actually can be used, and it might not be dark fantasy. They can be very much realism, or, well, no, some of them cannot be realism, but they can be realism, or it can be very light fantasy, right? So those are elements, but it really then starts to come down to, well, like, what is the story about? What is the tone, right? And how much of that is written into the script, the blueprint, and how much of that is really left to the theatricality, right? Especially in theater, in live performance, we're not as used to dark fantasy and horror as other mediums like right, TV and film. So when people are reading plays, and I don't mean when playwrights are reading plays, but that too, I think that, maybe when literary managers or other folks are reading plays, that tone sometimes is hard to understand. Sometimes you have to be so explicit. This is a dark fantasy. This is, it's really not going to make sense if you are imagining staging it like you would, like a family drama, even if it has a family in it. Right. So it's very much the tone. It's very much about, and in that way, if we think of like tone being expressed through stage directions, then there is a way to write the stage directions in that tone of dark fantasy.
Yeah. And you just talking about needing to explicitly say, like, categorize what genre this is when you jump into a play. It made me think about a conversation we've previously had about using dark fantasy versus magical realism. And sometimes when you say fantasy, it feels childish, or you think youth. And so you use magical realism to sound more mature. And this is serious work, is magical realism. But I think that as you're talking, and then also what Hannah had said, is the word fantasy evoking something that's childlike and childish is also super important for adults, because your fears are rooted in what you experienced as a child. Like, most things that you fear are still the exact same things as when you were a toddler. It just shifts a little bit. Your boogeyman changes a little bit. It's no longer the monster under the bed or in the closet. It's that monster that you face at work. It's the monster that's in strangers. It's the monster that's in various experiences that you have as an adult. It's just morphed and changed. And so I don't know, you talking about that just reminded me of made me think differently about the word fantasy and how important it is to use that versus trying to sound more mature with magical realism, because in actuality, they are the same thing.
They are. And I love the term speculative fiction. I think that actually, for me, it fits better. But there is kind of I find that in the theater world, using terms from the world of novels doesn't go over so well. I've tried it, speculative fantasy, speculative performance. Yeah, no.
What drew you to your first dark fantasy story? Why were you like, this story needs to fit into this genre, or this is how I have to tell this story?
Yeah. So two examples. The first is I was devising a piece with a collaborator about the voyage of South Asian indentured laborers from South Asia to the Caribbean. And the research, which was interesting because the all of the research about these voyages were actually, the books were in the economics library versus the sociology library, because it was really, it was a trade, right? It was about trade. And so the conditions were horrible. Like, people were often tricked into making these voyages across what they called the Kala Pani, or black water, and the conditions were terrible, right? Like, people's excretions, they're sitting in it for weeks, and they're sick from that, they're going mad, they're malnourished, all of this. So the last scene of this devised piece was of a woman who was experiencing this in the bowels of one of these ships. And I was playing the character, and I'd written it. And so we were trying out different, lighting and stuff. And like, I love horror. I'm gonna come back to another story related to this. But so I was like, we were working with the lighting design person, and she was like, yeah, let's like do this green light, and it'll be just like really creepy. And it's like, yeah, let's do that. And we were performing it at a festival in Toronto, and I heard a few people towards the front be like, this is scary. And I was like, oh yes. Because it should be. It should actually absolutely be utterly fucking frightening, because it is about torture. There is no other way to get around, like, for me, like, what it should be evoking, right? Like, it is horror that I cannot conceive. Like, I cannot comprehend that level of brutality and captivity. Like, it's just the only way that I can imagine it is through dark fantasy. So, like, having had that experience, I was writing a play about the partition of the South Asian subcontinent in 1947, which my family was involved in, and I had done oral history interviews with them, and I was putting the story together, trying to understand, like, how do I make this? Because again, like, I can't conceive of that kind of violence, like living through it, right? Of that, and that kind of despair and dislocation. And then I saw these pictures that a photographer had taken of the partition, with just bodies strewn all over a street and vultures pecking at them. And I was like, oh, vultures. Like, they are such a objective character in this, right? Like, they're really not, they don't have a side they want to take. They're just doing what they do, right? Like, but they're also super creepy. And so they gave me a way into the story as both narrators and as like they became townspeople that would go to each other on. They became both like the helper of the protagonist and someone who would push her into like making really bad decisions. So that was the talking animal element of it. And then the protagonist had a superpower of sewing. We were introduced to that early in the play when life was normal, and she was sewing the embroidery on her wedding blouse. And then when the violence erupts in their village, she becomes separated from her family. Dismemberment was a big part of the way that the different communities would violate each other. And so using her superpower of sewing and in her madness of dealing with this loss of her family and her community and her husband who was killed in the violence and dismembered, she gathers his body pieces trying to sew them back together. So in some ways it's dealing with like her a superpower is like the sewing, and it's a way that her madness is allowing her to deal with the agony, right? And how to just like get through this next moment of like, I know this is what I know how to do. Like, I don't know how to grieve this big, but I know how to sew and I can do this. So that was the first foray into really like digging into that dark fantasy / horror elements.
What an incredible way to explore the dark history and horrific history really in this theatrical way. It seems like this genre really leans into theatricality and allows for this kind of exploration in a way that maybe would be harder to get audiences or people just in general to engage with. Can you talk about maybe the freedom that has given you, or, other discoveries that you've made that it is allowing you to explore?
Yeah. I mean, as I said, I think that some of this is really incomprehensible. I feel a need to mention, well, I think I'll get to that. But so in terms of leaning into theatricality, that is part of what I'm interested in as a performance maker. Otherwise, I would make documentaries, or I would write, I would do research and do more historical texts. But I think because those are things that I really cannot process, like that kind of violence and dislocation and, just situations are things that I'm not able to process, really emotionally or intellectually. Like it's a way to, I think, leaning into the theatricality of it, then also gives it something to be not just about the mind, but about like the body, about the world building, about the elements that are all around, like nature, like cultural institutions, like buildings, and like place. And so I want to give an example. I saw a version of Fucking A by Susan Laurie Parks. I think it was back in 2009 in DC. I think Second Stage did it. And it's one of those plays, you can read it. And to me, I read it as a dark fantasy, but it can be staged in so many ways, right? Like it's the theatrical element that you can only write so much of it in. Yes. And it's highly theatrical, right? So even as a piece of writing. But when I went to see it, the production really took that and ran with it, right? The roles of the hunters were played by people who were trained in parkour, I think it's called, where it's like flipping and swinging, and my God, like that kind of theatricality to bring to hunters, where like they can like leap from one area of the stage to the next, brings a kind of urgency and fear that like someone standing there with a sword like just does it, right? I mean, like that kind of theatricality is wonderful, right? The A on Hester's chest actually like did ooze something whenever she applied in when she performed an abortion. The role of Canary, like she was wonderful. The actor, she would perch right in her little yellow dress, and so I think so much of the theatricality is brought in the production, because I've seen other productions of it that were much more, for lack of a better word, domesticated, and we're very much like rooted in like, this is the house, these are the stairs that lead upstairs, versus like this is like this kind of jungle of a world that they're inhabiting. Prison, like home, the riverway, the boardwalk by the river. So the theatricality, I really think like there is only so much you can write in, right? Like uh I have talking vultures in the play, and what a director or a production chooses, how far they choose to push that, is really about joint vision at that point.
I'm just like sitting there imagining a lot of those things that you said and like putting that on stage. And now I need to reread that play so that I can look at it differently.
Was such a wonderful production. You know what I mean? Like I mean, really, it's 14 years later, and I still think it's one of the best productions I've ever seen. The acting was phenomenal. Like just the way that they conceived it and kept it moving, and yeah, yeah. It's just like dark fantasy also doesn't need a lot of money to do.
That's true. And a lot of people think that it does because like all these things have to happen, or like you have to figure out how to do these illusions or things like that. And it's like you could make it as big as you wanted to, but subtlety and simplicity, there's just so much you can do with that and play with people's suspense and their anxiety too. Is like the
Yeah.
simplest things are the things that bother, I think, people the most. And by is like sitting slightly unsettled.
Yeah, and I love that point, because it really, our perception, like what we experience is really like where our perception and experience is meeting this communal production, right? I mean, there are things that I've seen that I didn't want to watch, and then like at some other point I came back to it feeling much more comfortable or grounded and was willing to watch it. I mean, it wasn't about the thing, it was about me. Yeah, so yes, and yeah, I mean, it is about the anxiety. And I also think there's a way that dark fantasy and horror is, I think, a very it's a kind of proletariat populist genre, right? And like it doesn't necessarily go over well in, I would say, like more progressive, intellectual, highly educated circles, right? Because the metaphors aren't maybe quite as, I don't know. I'm not sure what, but and so all the more reason for them to be simple productions, really, right? Getting too literal with dark fantasy just really doesn't work.
How can dark fantasy be used to explore politics and spirituality?
Because for me, the supernatural is really a way to provide some of my characters with some agency, right? Like there are people in situations where no amount of like hashtags, petitions, policies, protests, strikes, that's never going to be enough to bring about justice or humanity or equity or transformation in their world. And so imbuing those characters with some supernatural powers is, for me, really like a way of working out some of my anxieties, right? About the social justice work that I do. And like I get to play God and give them these powers. And I may not agree with the way that they're using them, right? But I think that it's a chance for the disempowered to have some agency and try to bring about some miracles and liberation, right? And their liberation might not be like an arrival. It's a unearthing of working right towards a deeper and deeper liberation, and it's painful, right? Yeah, that's just really important. Like they're imbued with these powers and then they take it where they want, and sometimes I really don't want them to take it there, and that's where they're going, but they get to choose sometimes the way that they're gonna use it. So I just felt like that's sort of important to say about like how much the characters are in a process of searching for their liberation, and sometimes what they find really may not be liberation, but it's certainly a step towards whatever that process is.
Thank you definitely for saying that. That's really powerful.
Yeah. Who would you say are strong influences for you in this genre? And then for our listeners that are interested in this genre and kind of want to step into this, the shadow side of stories. I like how you said that. What would you recommend them to do to learn more about it?
My influences are not just from the theater or performance world, right? So I'm going to talk about influences from different arts. I mean, Octavia Butler, for sure. She made me love world building and plot. Like, I love plot. I really do. I feel like, that's such a like so passe in the world of theater. Like plot, like I love plot. I'm like, what's gonna happen next? And so yeah, like Octavia Butler is brilliant at like, this is what happens next, and then this, and then this. Mythologies and cosmologies from every culture, right? Rosemary's Baby. Like, that was like seminal in my storytelling stuff. I'm like, oh my God, what could be worse than something growing inside of you? um and Carrie, which is like, like in terms of personal agency for someone that's marginalized, right? It's a great story of like this girl who was harassed and bullied and stuff, and then like, whoa, she conjured up like the power of the God and devil are very much a Christian paradigm, but she called forth some powers, and she got her revenge. So I think like those are really have been very strong influences. Music is super, super influential for me in my work. I'm really interested in the structure of music and how I can adapt that for plays. The polyrhythms and the tempo changes, I think, are for me really important structurally, and the dissonant sounds also. So I'm in terms of my dark fantasy and horror work, there's a few jazz musicians like Archie Shepp, Pharaoh Saunders, and even the Coltrane's, John and Alice Coltrane, who really move in some of those like dark, experimental, dissonant spheres. And then there's some bands like Slayer and Bad Brains and 12-Foot Ninjas, like, you know, like metal. I love the speed, and again, polyrhythms, the dissonance, the tempo changes, very like it's full of surprises. It's full of surprises. Like they can go into like 12-Foot Ninjas it will have their progression chords, heavy metal, speed, 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 and then like move into, you know, like a salsa mambo tempo and rhythm and you know, like the transition is flawless. Like it makes complete sense to me. So so those are really important influences. Dvorak, you know, very dark, and flamenco. Love flamenco song and music. Like the dissonance in that is, there's so much sorrow in it, so much resistance, but also like it's very playful. So, and like a very driving rhythm. Yeah. I think in terms of movies and TV, like The Empire Strikes Back, like Darth Vader and the stormtroopers were really scary when I was little. Guillermo del Toro's work, all of it. And like he is a dark fantasy person who really leans into the eroticism, which I love. Yeah, like it's just it's not sexual, but it is very sensual, very sensual. And I love the like the senses being there on stage, smell, touch, taste, right? George Romero's Night of the Living Dead, like the original. Wow. Like what? And like that was so before its time, like what he was doing politically in that. When we got to the end, I was like, what? Like it was just, yeah. Of course, Get Out, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, the original. And then some of the more contemporary TV stuff, like I think The Leftovers is a masterpiece. And Reservation Dogs. I love that. I love the humor, and then the mysticism and supernatural, but then also the very kind of, you know, very interpersonal relationships in this community aspects of it. So those are all things that resonate for me in terms of influences. In terms of performance work, Guillermo Gomez Peña and Coco Fusco's performance artwork, very political, quite dark. Susan Laurie Parks's work, Enda Walsh, Kathakali dance theater. It's from Kerala, India. It's you know, about demons and gods and humans, and there's lots of costumes, and it's all sung, and there's lots of movement, and it's, yeah, very theatrical. Adrian Kennedy's work, and then flamenco. So yeah, I think, and installation art in general, like you know, the influences. It's a multi-sensational like operation for me. Yeah, and I think, and in terms of things that I would recommend for listeners, those are all things that I would recommend for listeners. I think NPX is a great place to check out work, because if you're looking specifically for genre, you can type that genre in and find folks who are writing in that genre. A few like shout outs to my colleagues, like Locusts Have No King by J. Julian Christopher, The Things Are Against Us by Susan Soon-Hee Stanton, and Pitchforks by Andrew Kramer. You know, those three, like, yeah, I just like, they're great. Like they always stay in my head. That's definitely, that's a theater, that's a dark fantasy horror piece that's working on stage.
It's a fantastic list. We'll compile all of that so that our listeners can see it as well after the episode, if they want to check stuff out. Do you have any published plays or upcoming productions that listeners should know about, that we can tell folks about?
You can find all my plays on NPX. They are there to download. And yeah, I welcome them to be downloaded and read, and give me feedback if you're so inclined. Write a little review if you're so inclined. Tell your local theater artistic director to produce it if you're so inclined.
Yes. And for those who don't know, NPX is the New Play Exchange, and it's a fantastic resource for plays by writers all around the country and internationally. We hope that people will read them and produce them. Keep coming back for more.
Well, we have hit that time where we must ask the most important question of this interview. Where does theater begin for you?
Dissonance.
Theater begins with dissonance. I think that's our first one word mic drop. Just so you know.
Love it. Yes. Yeah. Okay. So I'm still sort of caught around your story of how, Riti, how theater sort of began when you were young with Charlie's Angels, and it got me thinking about, and also you were talking about, religious stories. And I think for me, theater began when I was young too, around stories, and often religious stories and fables. And those stories have stuck with me my whole life, and I still recall them. And then Alayna talking about how our fears are the same as when we were younger. So I think I'm hearkening back to young Hannah in this episode, and the things that frightened me, and those stories that were so fantastical. I was afraid of heaven when I was growing up. Like, we were supposed to, I grew up in the Christian tradition, and we were supposed to want heaven. But actually, when I thought about living in heaven forever, it gave me great anxiety and terror, and I would have these existential crises. And that for me was horror, the thought of heaven. So yeah, I think all of these things go through my head. So all of that is a long-winded way of saying theater begins with fascination and terror at a young age.
So theater begins when your awe and wonder lead you to the shadow side of stories, and you find that unsettling feeling that exists there delicious. I loved how you said delicious. And it just seemed the way your look is, I'm like, yeah, that person loves to sit in that unsettlement.
This is the one moment when it's too bad people can only hear us and not see us. At least,
if they could see us, I might have worn I might have washed my hair and tried to look pretty.
This is like the look. This is your new style. So
thank you so much. This was great to have this conversation with you. It's really helpful to articulate what I think about stuff. So I'm like, oh, okay.
It's really, you said some beautiful things. I meant it when I said I am excited about the transcript of it too. I'm also glad that you teach classes for us, because I think sometimes there's this idea that, dark fantasy is more about the shock factor or the titular quality of it, rather than what you were just saying, which is empowering and a way to explore the horrors of the world, of our history, of maybe our own environments. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you.
Join us for our next episode on December 27th, when we talk with Idris Goodwin about making theater for young audiences.
Thanks for listening to Playwright Center's Theater Begins Here.